This is for your own good. You've been acting strange. Everyone has noticed.
You've never once asked what I think, not about this, not about anything, and now you want to lock me away and call it protection. Your wife, the one you locked in a storage room like an animal, the one you told everyone was mentally unstable, has just saved this family's and—
This is impossible. Sandra loves me.
He locked his own wife inside your room like a prisoner. He told his family she was mad. He told his mistress she was nothing. But that same wife had been watching, listening, and waiting for 11 months. And the morning after he turned the key on her for the last time, he woke up to find his bank accounts empty, his business documents gone, and his family calling him with voices shaking in disbelief. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought your silence meant weakness, stay with me till the end, because this story is about to show you what happens when a quiet woman finally decides to speak. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this one, stories about betrayal, karma, and women who refuse to stay small, are exactly what this channel is built on. Let's start from the beginning. In a small town outside Owerri, there lived a man named Michael. Michael was the last son of his mother Elizabeth, a proud, sharp-tongued woman who believed she knew what was best for her children, especially her sons. Michael was 26 when his mother decided it was time for him to marry. She didn't ask him who he wanted. She had already chosen. Her name was Faith. Faith was the daughter of a man named John, a farmer who had died 3 years earlier, leaving behind a widow and 4 children with barely enough land to survive on. Faith was the eldest. She had given up her own dreams of finishing school so her younger siblings could eat. She cooked, she farmed, she fetched water before sunrise, and she never complained. Elizabeth had watched her grow up. She trusted her, she respected her, and she believed a woman like that was exactly what her restless son needed. Michael didn't agree. He didn't disagree either. He simply didn't care enough to argue. He had always done what his mother wanted when it didn't cost him much, and marrying Faith felt like something he could tolerate. He wasn't cruel yet. He was just distant, indifferent. The kind of indifference that, given enough time and enough temptation, can cuddle into something much darker. The wedding was simple. No lights, no big hall, just family, a few neighbors, and a modest meal. Faith wore a wrapper that had belonged to her late mother and smiled through the entire ceremony, even though something in her chest told her this marriage had started on a foundation that wasn't hers to build. For the first year, things were quiet, predictable. Michael worked odd jobs in town, saving money bit by bit. Faith managed the house, cared for Elizabeth, and slowly, without anyone noticing, began to understand the rhythms of the family business. Michael's late father had left behind 2 old trucks used for transporting goods between towns, and Michael had taken over managing them, though he barely understood the paperwork. Faith, sharp in a way nobody bothered to notice, would sit quietly in the corner while Michael argued with drivers and suppliers, absorbing every number, every name, every discrepancy. Nobody thought to ask the village wife what she thought. Nobody thought she was even capable of thinking. That was their first mistake. 2 years into the marriage, Michael's transport business began to grow. A contact in the city offered him a partnership hauling goods for a bigger distribution company, and within 18 months, 2 trucks became 11. Michael relocated to Port Harcourt to manage operations there, visiting the village only once or twice a month. Faith stayed behind with Elizabeth, as was expected of a good wife. Nobody asked if she wanted to go with him. Nobody asked if she was lonely. She simply stayed and she adapted, the way she always had. It was in Port Harcourt that Michael met Sandra. Sandra was everything Faith wasn't, at least on the surface. She was loud where Faith was quiet, glamorous where Faith was plain, always dressed like she had somewhere important to be. She worked as a sales representative for one of the companies Michael supplied goods to, and their first conversation was about an overdue invoice. By the third conversation, it wasn't about invoices anymore. Michael fell for her fast. Too fast. The kind of fast that happens when a man wants to feel like someone important, someone desired, someone more than a village woman's obligation. Sandra made him feel like a big man. She laughed at his jokes, she wore the perfume he liked, she never once mentioned his responsibilities home. Within 4 months, they were living together in an apartment Michael paid for. And within a year, Sandra was pressuring him with a question that would come to define everything that followed. When are you sending that village woman away? At first, Michael brushed it off. Faith was his wife. There were things you didn't do, even in the middle of an affair. But Sandra was patient, and Sandra was persistent, and slowly, the way water wears down stone, she chipped at his hesitation. She's not even educated, Sandra would say. What is she going to do for you? Cook. I can hire someone to cook. What does she add to your life, Michael? You are a big man now. Big men don't carry village luggage. Michael started to believe her. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to stop calling Faith as often, enough to send less money home, enough to start seeing his own wife as an inconvenience rather than a person. But here is where the story stops being simple, because Sandra herself was not who she appeared to be. While she postured as a woman deeply in love, deeply invested in Michael's success, Sandra had quietly been doing her own calculations. She had seen Michael's business grow. She had seen the properties he was starting to acquire, the second truck fleet he was planning to launch in Aba, the money moving through his accounts. Sandra wasn't trying to replace Faith because she loved Michael more than his wife did. Sandra was clearing a path towards something she had been planning long before she ever met him. Nobody saw it, not Michael, blinded by attention he mistook for love, not Elizabeth, who was too far away and too trusting of her son's judgment, and certainly not Faith, though Faith, quiet as she was, had started to notice something else entirely. It began with small things. A truck driver named Peter, one of the longest-serving employees in Michael's company, started stopping by the family compound whenever he passed through the village. Officially, he came to greet Elizabeth and deliver goods from Michael. Unofficially, he had grown to respect Faith in a way few people did. He noticed how she asked questions about fuel costs and delivery schedules that most wives would never think to ask. He noticed she remembered every number he mentioned weeks later without needing to write it down. One evening, as Peter unloaded a delivery, he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the company's expenses had ballooned strangely over the past year. Fuel costs that didn't match distances traveled, maintenance bills for trucks that hadn't broken down, payments to a logistics coordinator in Port Harcourt named Sandra, a title Faith had never heard before, for services nobody could clearly explain. Faith said nothing. She simply listened, the way she always did. But that night, she couldn't sleep. Something didn't sit right, and the quiet part of her mind, the part that had spent years watching, calculating, and remembering, began to work. Over the following months, Faith started paying closer attention. She began asking Peter casual questions whenever he visited, framing her curiosity as simple wifely concern for her husband's business. Peter, unaware he was helping build a case, answered honestly. Faith learned that Sandra had convinced Michael to route certain payments through her own account, supposedly for tax purposes. She learned that 2 of the newer trucks were registered not under the company name, but under Sandra's personal name. She learned that Michael had signed documents he likely never fully read, trusting Sandra's assurance that it was just paperwork. Faith began to write things down, Not in a notebook that Michael or Elizabeth might find, but in a small exercise book she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the room she slept in, the same room that would later become her prison. Dates, amounts, names, every detail Peter mentioned, every strange comment Elizabeth made about Michael's dwindling visit, every excuse Michael gave for not sending money home. Faith was building something, even though she couldn't yet say what. Meanwhile, in Port Harcourt, Sandra's pressure campaign intensified. "Send her a divorce paper," Sandra told Michael one night. "Just tell her it's over. You don't owe her an explanation." "It's not that simple. My mother chose her. There will be questions." "Then don't divorce her," Sandra said, her voice suddenly softer, more calculated. "Just make her disappear from the picture. Send her back to her mother's house. Tell your mother she's sick, mentally unstable, whatever you need to say. People will believe it if you say it with enough confidence." It was a cruel idea, but Michael, weakened by 2 years of Sandra's influence and his own guilt curdling into resentment, agreed. If he couldn't bring himself to end the marriage outright, he would simply erase Faith from his life quietly, painfully, without ever taking responsibility for what he was doing to her. The plan began 3 months later when Michael finally returned to the village for an extended visit, ostensibly to check on his mother's health. Elizabeth had been having trouble with her blood pressure, and Michael used the visit as cover for what he really intended to do. On his second night home, Michael told Faith he needed to speak with her privately. He led her to the small storage room at the back of the compound, a room normally used to keep yams and farming tools, and told her to wait there while he brought something to show her. Faith, trusting despite everything she had begun to suspect, walked in. Michael locked the door behind her. "This is for your own good," he said through the wood, his voice flat, rehearsed, like he had practiced the words in front of a mirror. "You've been acting strange. Everyone has noticed. I'm doing this to protect you and this family." Faith said nothing first. She simply sat down on an overturned bucket in the dim room, lit only by a small window near the ceiling, and let the silence stretch between them. "You've never once asked what I think," she finally said, her voice steady, almost eerily calm. "Not about this marriage, not about your business, not about anything, and now you want to lock me away and call it protection." Michael didn't answer. He walked away. For the rest of that week, Faith remained locked in the room for hours at a time, released only to cook, clean, or use the latrine under Michael's supervision, always with some excuse ready for anyone. To Elizabeth, he claimed Faith had been having strange fits of anger and needed rest. To the neighbors, he said even less, letting rumors fill the silence he created. Elizabeth, though uneasy, trusted her son. She had chosen Faith, yes, but she had also raised Michael to be a man of some integrity. And it did not occur to her, not yet, that her own son could be capable of such calculated cruelty. But Faith was not idle during those long hours in the dark. She had already hidden her exercise book beneath the floorboard weeks earlier, anticipating, in some quiet corner of her mind, that things were building towards something like this. Now, locked away with nothing but time, she used the hours to organize her thoughts, to plan, to remember every detail Peter had ever shared, every inconsistency she had noted, every name and figure that didn't add up. She thought about her father, John, who had died, believing her eldest daughter would always find a way to survive, no matter what life threw at her. She thought about her younger siblings, who still depended on whatever small support she could offer them. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised even her, that she was not going to let this marriage, this man, or this cruel woman in the city take away everything she had quietly built. On the 4th day of her confinement, something happened that changed everything. Elizabeth, increasingly suspicious of her son's behavior, decided to visit the storage room herself while Michael was out running errands in town. She found Faith sitting on the floor, calmly, not raging, not weeping, but simply waiting, the way a woman waits when she has already decided what she's going to do. "Faith," Elizabeth said, unlocking the door with a spare key she had kept without her son's knowledge. "What is really going on?" Faith looked at her mother-in-law for a long moment before answering. "Ask your son about a woman named Sandra. Ask him why 2 of his trucks are registered under her name. Ask him why the company's money has been disappearing for over a year. And then ask yourself why he needed to lock his wife in a room instead of simply divorcing her if all he wanted was to be free." Elizabeth's face changed slowly, the way a sky changes before a storm, from confusion to disbelief to something colder and more dangerous. She had known her son had been distant. She had suspected there was another woman, but she had never imagined he would sink low enough to imprison his own wife to hide it. "How do you know all this?" Elizabeth asked. Faith reached beneath the floorboard and retrieved her exercise book, the pages filled with months of careful observation. She handed it to Elizabeth without a word. Elizabeth read through it in silence, her hand trembling slightly as she turned each page. Dates, names, amounts, a pattern that had clearly been forming over a year, hidden in plain sight from everyone except the one person nobody had bothered to take seriously. That night, Elizabeth confronted Michael, but Faith, ever careful, ever patient, had already set something else in motion, something Michael and Sandra would not discover until it was far too late to stop. Now, it is here that I need you to pause with me for a moment, because what happens next is the twist that changes everything, and I don't want you to miss it. If you are enjoying this story so far, go ahead and subscribe now, because the next part is where everything Michael and Sandra thought they controlled starts slipping through their fingers. Now, back to the story. Weeks before Michael locked Faith in that room, Peter, the truck driver who had unknowingly been feeding Faith information for months, had grown increasingly uneasy about the discrepancies he'd noticed in the company's finances. Loyal to Michael's late father, who had given him his first job decades earlier, Peter felt a responsibility to protect the business, even from Michael's own carelessness. He had mentioned his concerns to Faith almost as a way of processing them out loud, never imagining she would do anything with the information beyond simple wifely worry. But Faith had asked him one crucial question during one of his visits. If something happened to the business records, who else would know how to find the truth? Peter had mentioned a name, Joseph, an accountant in Aba, who did independent audits for Michael's father years earlier and still kept old records as a matter of professional habit. Faith had quietly written the name down along with Peter's description of where Joseph's office was located. 3 days into her confinement, using a moment when Michael's supervision lapsed while he took a phone call outside, Faith had slipped a folded note to a young househelp named Grace, asking her to deliver it to Peter the next time he came through the village. The note contained a simple message: contact Joseph, tell him everything Peter knows, and ask him to look into whether the trucks registered under Sandra's name were done so legally, and whether the company's tax filings matched what was actually being reported. Peter, moved both loyalty to the business and growing suspicion about Sandra's role in it, drove to Aba the very next day. What Joseph uncovered over the next 2 weeks was worse than anyone imagined. Sandra had not simply convinced Michael to route payments through her account for vague reasons. She had systematically been embezzling funds through inflated invoices, ghost maintenance costs, and fraudulent fuel claims for over 16 months. The 2 trucks registered under her name were not, as she claimed, temporary arrangements for tax convenience. She had structured the paperwork so that if Michael's business ever collapsed under investigation, those assets would remain entirely hers, untouched by any legal fallout. She was not building a future with Michael. She was extracting one, piece by piece, preparing to disappear the moment she had taken enough. This was Sandra's real plan all along, the plan Michael never saw because he was too intoxicated by her attention to notice he was being used. She had never intended to marry him. She had never intended to stay. Faith was never truly her rival for Michael's heart. Faith was simply an obstacle standing between Sandra and full, unquestioned control over what she had been quietly stealing. Joseph compiled everything into a detailed report: financial records, falsified documents, bank statements showing the pattern of transfers, and handed it to Peter, who brought it back to the village and delivered it, at great personal risk, to Elizabeth herself, exactly as Faith had arranged. Peter, who brought it back to the village and delivered it at great personal risk to Elizabeth herself, exactly as Faith had arranged. Elizabeth, holding both Faith's handwritten notes and Joseph's formal financial report, understood now that she was looking at something far bigger than a simple affair. Her son's entire business, the business her late husband had built from nothing, was being hollowed out from the inside by a woman he trusted completely, while he was busy discarding the one person who had actually been trying, quietly and without recognition, to protect it. The confrontation happened on a Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after Michael had first locked Faith in that storage room. Elizabeth called Michael into the main house, and waiting there with her, unknown to Michael, until he walked through the door, were Peter and Joseph, along with the full financial report laid out on the table. "Sit down," Elizabeth said, her voice colder than Michael had ever heard it. Michael sat, confused, glancing between his mother and the 2 men whose presence he couldn't immediately explain. "Your wife, the one you locked in a storage room like an animal, the one you told everyone was mentally unstable, has just saved this family's entire business from a woman who was planning to steal everything and vanish." Michael was confused as Joseph began walking him through the documents. Every inflated invoice, every fraudulent registration, every transfer routed quietly into Sandra's personal account over the past 16 months. Michael sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing without sound, as the full scope of his own blindness unfolded in front of him. "This isn't possible," he finally managed. "Sandra loves me. She wouldn't do this." "She's been doing it for over a year," Joseph said flatly. "The only question now is how much of it can still be recovered." Elizabeth stood up slowly, walked to the door of the storage room herself, and unlocked it. Though this time, Faith was not inside. She had been moved, quietly, into Elizabeth's own room 3 days earlier, the moment Elizabeth learned the truth, protected now by the very woman who had once chosen her without ever truly seeing her. "You will call Sandra tonight. You will tell her nothing has changed. And tomorrow, Joseph and Peter will go with you to freeze every account, cancel every fraudulent registration, and begin the process of getting back what she has stolen. Do you understand me?" Michael, hollow now, nodded silently. But here is another twist, because Sandra was not a woman who left things to chance. Unbeknownst to Michael, Sandra had grown suspicious herself over the past week, noticing that Michael's calls had become less frequent, his voice more strained. She had her own contact within the company's Port Harcourt office, a junior clerk she had bribed months earlier to alert her if anyone started asking unusual questions about the accounts. That clerk had called her just hours before Elizabeth's confrontation with Michael, warning her that an accountant from her bar had been requesting records related to truck registrations and payment histories. Sandra didn't wait to find out how much Michael knew. That same night, While Elizabeth was still laying out the evidence in the village, Sandra was already transferring whatever funds remained accessible into a separate account under a name that had nothing to do with her or Michael. By morning, when Michael finally worked up the courage to call her, pretending nothing had changed, exactly as his mother instructed, Sandra's phone was switched off. The apartment Michael had been paying for was empty. She had left nothing behind, except an old wrapper Faith would have recognized instantly as the kind sold cheaply in local markets. A small, almost mocking detail, suggesting Sandra had never actually been the woman of sophistication she pretended to be. She was gone, along with a portion of the funds she had managed to move before anyone could stop her. Michael had lost his mistress, but more importantly, in that single night, he had lost the illusion that had governed his entire decision-making for the past 2 years. Sandra was never the answer to some deeper dissatisfaction in his life. She was simply a con artist who recognized better than Michael's own family had exactly how easy it would be to manipulate a man desperate to feel important. The following weeks were consumed by damage control. Joseph worked tirelessly with lawyers in Port Harcourt to freeze whatever remained of Sandra's accounts, though a significant portion of what she had stolen was never recovered. The 2 trucks registered in her name were seized through legal action, though the process cost Michael nearly as much in fees as the trucks themselves were worth. The business survived, barely, propped up by emergency loans and the goodwill Michael's late father had built over decades. Goodwill that was now stretched to its absolute limit. But something else had shifted, something more permanent than any financial recovery. Elizabeth, who had once believed her son incapable of true cruelty, now looked at him with a wariness that would take years, if ever, to fully soften. She had chosen Faith for him, believing in her heart that Faith's quiet strength would balance his son's restlessness. She had never imagined that same restlessness would cuddle into the kind of cruelty that locks a woman away simply for being inconvenient. And Faith herself had changed in ways that went far beyond the events of that single week. For years, she had accepted her role quietly, absorbing indignity after indignity, telling herself that patience was its own kind of strength. But something had cracked open in her during those days locked in that small, dim room. Some final recognition that quiet endurance without action was simply another form of disappearing. She had spent months gathering information not out of vengeance, but out of a growing understanding that if she didn't protect herself, no one else was going to do it for her. 3 weeks after Sandra's disappearance, once the immediate crisis had stabilized, Faith sat down with Elizabeth and had a conversation that would determine the rest of her life. I'm not going back to how things were. I won't be locked away again, physically or otherwise. If Michael wants this marriage to continue, it has to look completely different from what it was. Elizabeth, chastened by everything that had happened, agreed without argument. She had already begun insisting that Michael formally include Faith in the business, not as a token gesture, but as someone with actual oversight, given how thoroughly Faith's attention to detail had exposed what months of Michael's own inattention had missed. Michael, humbled in a way he had never experienced before, didn't resist. Whatever pride he might have clung to before had been thoroughly dismantled by the events of the past month. He had been outmaneuvered not by a rival businessman or a clever competitor, but by his own wife, the woman he had dismissed as uneducated and unworthy of consideration, and by the mistress he had trusted more than the family that actually stood by him. Faith took on a formal role managing the company's records and logistics, working directly with Joseph and Peter, both of whom had come to respect her sharp, methodical mind in ways Michael never had. Within a year, the business was not only recovered but operating more efficiently than it had ever had under Michael's sole management, largely because Faith brought a level of scrutiny and organization that simply never existed before. Michael's marriage to Faith did not become some fairy tale reconciliation. Trust, once broken so thoroughly, doesn't rebuild itself overnight, and there were long stretches of silence between them, evenings where old resentments surfaced, conversations that ended in tears or cold withdrawal. But something had fundamentally changed in the balance of that relationship. Faith was no longer the invisible village wife waiting quietly in the background. She was a woman who had proven decisively and irreversibly that her silence had never meant weakness. It had simply meant she was watching and waiting for the moment she needed to act. As for Sandra, she was never fully located. Rumors circulated for years afterwards, some claiming she had resurfaced in Lagos under a different name, running a similar scheme on another unsuspecting man, others claiming she had left the country entirely. Whatever the truth, she became a lesson repeated quietly throughout the family for years to come, a warning about the dangers of mistaking flattery for love and attention for genuine devotion. 2 years after that fateful week, Elizabeth, sitting on the veranda of the family compound, watched Faith and Michael's young daughter playing in the yard, chasing chickens with the kind of unrestrained joy only children seem capable of. Faith emerged from the house carrying a tray of food, her presence in that compound no longer that of a tolerated obligation, but of a woman fully, undeniably in her rightful place. "I chose well," Elizabeth said quietly to herself, watching her daughter-in-law move with the same quiet confidence she always had, though now that confidence was seen, acknowledged, respected by everyone who had once overlooked it. And somewhere, in a room that was once used to store yams and farming tools, the door remained permanently unlocked, a small, deliberate reminder of a lesson the entire family had learned the hard way. The quietest person in the room is often the one paying the closest attention, and the day you decide to lock them away is often the very day they finally decide to act. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath waiting to see whether Faith would finally get the justice she deserved, let me know in the comments below. Tell me which part shocked you the most, whether it was Michael locking his own wife away or Sandra's true motives finally coming to light. Stories like this remind us that karma doesn't always come loudly or immediately, but it comes, and it comes for everyone eventually. If you believe in stories that reward patience, wisdom, and quiet strength over cruelty and deception, make sure you're subscribed because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and I will see you in the next one.